I'm Gary Broderick, and I work in the SAIL project. And SAIL is a project that works with women in addiction. It's the only women's-only project in the country. We're very proud of that. And it began about 19 years ago, where a lot of the women were going into the local methadone clinic, and there were no services for them to connect with. And there was the realization that women in addiction needed different kind of services to men. And so SAIL began, and away we went. And so when I was asked to talk about relationship and addiction at this conference, I began to feel great. Yeah, I can talk about relationship and addiction. But then I started to get really worried because it was social care, and I didn't know very much about social care. And I was kind of, well, the whole idea is that we're sharing ideas and sharing that kind of, how do you do that connectedness piece in your workplace? So that's exclusively what I'm going to kind of present from my experience for you to adapt and use or dismiss in whatever way. SAIL is a place where relationships happen. I'm told, again, I'm not speaking very effectively around social care. I'm also going to talk about women in addiction, and I'm a man, in case you hadn't noticed. So I'm constantly learning. But one of the things that became apparent when I started working in SAIL was that women are very relational beings. And I've been with women all my life, but I hadn't noticed it that much until I went into SAIL. And it was that kind of awareness or that learning that when you add addiction to women, you get double the impact. Not so much that women are a lot of the time more susceptible to addiction, but it does more damage. Because one of the things that addiction does is it breaks relationships, it damages relationships. And when I started working in SAIL, it became apparent very quickly that I needed to kind of almost change the way that I worked in addiction. Before I worked in SAIL, I worked in a street agency, the Anna Liffey Drug Project. I was the manager there, where we had lots of people who were in active addiction come in the door. Before that, I was working in a methadone clinic where I was a counsellor. It was great. I used to sit in a room and somebody used to come in and I used to counsel them, and then they used to go away again. And I thought I had really good relationships with them until I started to kind of explore what that was about. So I suppose the key things that I want to share with you today are in those four pieces. SAIL, to tell you a little bit about SAIL and what we do and what we're about, and to show you some pictures of it so you get some sense of who we are. Addiction, and kind of what my take on addiction is. Trauma. You've already been talking about trauma this morning, or this afternoon, and how that is present in addiction too. And then responding as an addiction worker, because one of the things that I learned in terms of relationship was that when you start being more connected or being more there in relationship, do you want to come up and join us up here? You can stay comfortable back there if you like, but was that you change as a person too. I didn't realize that quite as much when we started. But if you start, or if you approach your work differently, if you build it on relationship, then you start changing. You start being different. And I'll share a little bit about that. SAIL is an Irish word for life. I can't pronounce all of the different words if anybody is fluent in Irish, but they translate as stability, ability, work, and learning. And SAIL developed as a community project, and as a community project, it was a response to women. So we do lots of education, rehabilitation, advocacy, and childcare. one of the things we learned very quickly in Sale was that if you have a service for women, you have to have a service for children too. Not all the women who come have children, but enough of them do that you can't actually provide services without a childcare service. So we have an early education centre that works as a creche for a maximum of about 10 children. We've worked for the last 19 years working with women, and part of it was to highlight and to become more aware ourselves, but to share that then with others, that women who use drugs experience the world differently to men who use drugs. It's not the same thing. And again, as I said, part of that is that the impact of broken relationships and the shame and the guilt that goes with all of that, the absolute devastation that women feel. I'm not saying men don't as well, but women particularly feel it in that they've let everybody down. The stigma attached to being a mother who uses drugs. It's one thing to be a woman who uses drugs. To be a mother who uses drugs. It's like, how could you? How could you do that to your kids? Imagine to be trying to get some kind of recovery with that meeting you at every place that you go. And then the obvious fears. They're obvious to us now, but maybe not to everybody watching in. That women who use drugs and who are mothers are scared for their children. They're scared about the impact their drug use is having on the kids. They're scared about the drug use that's happening in their local community. They're scared about losing their children because of their drug use. And they also know that their drug use is affecting their ability to be good at being with their children. And part of the knowledge is that they know that their parents weren't good at it either, because in most of the occasions there's intergenerational drug and alcohol use going on, and they felt the impact. Women who use drugs have different needs to men who use drugs, physically, emotionally, socially. SAIL is dedicated to improving the services of female drug users in general, and particularly for those in the north inner city of Dublin. We're based on Amiens Street, if you know the inner city. I thought I'd show you some pictures, because pictures will do it better than me explaining it. This is on Rosie Hackett Bridge, the only bridge in Dublin named after a woman, so we decided to host an event there. That was to celebrate recovery and do it out in the open, but it was also to call on a reduction of domestic violence. And when we were setting up this event, which was a really nice kind of short event that we did, we were going to release some balloons, and then we found out that you couldn't release balloons because you might bring down low-flying aircraft. It's bizarre. So we decided to make some banners, or the women decided to make banners, and that's just Joanne there with one of them. The power of hope ignites endless possibilities. My wish is that hope lives within us all. This was us at our birthday party. SAIL's birthday is around the 16th of October. And here they're singing. There's a group of people in front of them. And I had this great idea that we would sing, do you know Joni Mitchell's The Circle Game? It's an old song. And that we would sing that, and it would be linked with this whole kind of piece that we were going to develop. And they didn't agree with that. They dumped all that, but they liked The Circle Game, so they learned that and they sang it anyway, just connected, which was great. And you can see the colours and everything in the background, where the group owns the room that they're in, that they created as they are. This is a few weeks ago at Halloween, and what I like about that particular picture is that 3 of the women came without any costumes at all. And part of the buzz and the connection in SAIL was that themselves, the staff, the other women who were there, made up all the costumes to create them there and then, and painted faces and such like. And they don't look that unhappy about it. Again, helping people connect to bring them from whatever place they are in when they arrive. The picture on the top is in a local community hall where we brought together women from drug services across Dublin and beyond. When you're a woman in a drug service, you're in the minority, because there's usually about 3 to 1 in terms of gender, 3 men for 1 woman. Sometimes it's down to 2 to 1, and sometimes it's as many as 4 to 1. But either way, you're in the minority. So there is a natural bent towards the needs of men. and people don't often think about women. Even something as simple as if you're going to book an appointment to meet with a woman, it's better to do it in the morning because she likely has to collect the kids from school afterwards. Because if you're a woman in addiction, you have to keep your addiction going, but you also have to keep all the other things going in your life too, like your mother-in-law and your kids and the bills and the managing all the different pieces. This was a picture taken at another event, and I kind of liked it because we looked like this big family. And in effect, that's part of some of the vibe that has happened over the last number of years in Sale, where that connectedness and that connection is there. And the children involved in the photograph, and people being proud. And one of the things that we began to do in Sale, this happened because the women were interested in looking at personal care and presentation, but they decided to dress differently. There's no dress code in Sale, you come as you want. But part of what it was that we as staff had to look at how we were dressing, but equally the women who were coming in, there was one rule very early on that came in that they weren't allowed to come in pyjamas. But that's in the community, that's completely permissible. But we weren't doing that in Sale. But then they gradually began to move away from dressing in tracksuits, and they started to have their clothes for work. And it was just part of that kind of organic thing that began, that we said that in this journey, in this recovery place, that they were doing things differently. They were choosing to do things differently. And they were developing that from each other rather than from staff. And this is part of the building. What I like about this is that when you enter Sale, usually you meet a hall full of buggies and prams. Again, about connection, about who we are, about what's acceptable. And when you go down that little set of stairs there, and around the corner you go we have a big room downstairs. And when you're in that room and doing all your work, usually you're inundated with the sound of the children running about upstairs. And again, the connectedness, the acceptance that's in the building. This is just part of the artwork in the classroom. This was a tree that was created. And on the tree there's loads of hooks, and the groups change the art every part of the season. It's a way of marking journey, because when you're in addiction, time blurs a lot of the time. So it helps mark the seasons, mark what's important, but it's also their room, their space, and they choose what goes on. This is the kitchen. It's a lovely, friendly space, even though it's downstairs in the basement. There's a kind of an old Aga in the background, and the thing about the table is that lots of the women come to Sale, and maybe they're in a bedsit, maybe they're in a one-bedroom apartment, maybe they're in homeless accommodation. Maybe they don't have a table. Sitting down and being together over a meal, over regular breakfast, doesn't always happen in their everyday life. So when they come into Sale, it can happen. Lots of the women, because they're in active addiction, don't look after themselves. And so some of them don't eat. The only time they eat is when they're in Sale. One of the things when people start Sale, working with us, they have to learn how to be with each other. I know you have that experience in residential care, where people have to learn to sit around the table, learn how to eat together and communicate in that way.
Can I just ask, are women on drugs whilst they're in the program, or?
We give them the drugs, yeah. Yes, we don't ask people to be drug-free. We don't ask people to be drug-free. We ask them to be stable enough to manage a group. If they go on to the community employment, which is 5 mornings a week, it's 3 hours, 5 mornings a week. So it's quite extensive, so they have to be relatively stable. But no, we have groups for drug-free. We have kind of lots of training and education, but there's no request for, we like stability, but whatever that form that takes. See, in many cases, there's so many different problems around. The drug use is only part of the story. And sometimes it's unwise to give up the drugs too soon until you've got some stability elsewhere. And again, with the judgment that's around, that's very often the last place that people would start. They come in saying, I need to get off. And that's the starting point, but hopefully what we can do through that working and learning together and the women sharing together, that they begin to understand that maybe there are these other changes first. But we hope that they'll get drug-free. That's a nice dream, but it's not something that we push for. And this area here is the smoking area. I wish they weren't smoking, because I think they're probably doing more damage than all the other drugs that they're taking, and we legitimize them smoking. But they're adult women and they're choosing to smoke. Their call. So we did up the smoking area and we made it a pleasant place to be, because that's where they spend a lot of time. They gather there and they're together in the space. And this is just finally a picture of the children's project. This is inside. It's a small space. There's 2 rooms. The other room is quite big, although it looks small in the way the photograph is taken. And this is from a height looking down into our back garden. We have all-weather grass, and the children can go out there regularly. For the children to be able to play with supervision, with support, it's not always able for them. A lot of the time they're not outdoors, they're not, they don't have access to that freedom. So the garden is a huge bonus for them. This is Amiens Street. That's not an extensive blue sky, that's just where I cut off the photograph. And this is Sale just here. It's a little black door. We don't do anything to highlight ourselves because we don't really want to attract lots of people. We try and create a safe space. And when you're a women's project, sometimes you have to be very careful of the men in their lives. This is really the street, because as you can see, there's a vacant buildings there, Lithuanian shop. This was an ex-community development that was now kind of empty. There's a few people moving in there, running a few businesses out of it. And all these, this one is Mary Lou McDonald's office, and then all these, all the way down here, are all homeless services. And across the road, and the reason why Sale was located in that area, is a major methadone clinic. So it's a place of poverty, a place where there's lots of services. And if you go up and around the corner, there's more services. The intensity of services in the area is quite high. So, although females tend to be less likely to have addictions than males, when they go on to develop addiction, they present with greater and more complex needs. In Sale, one of the workers, she always says when she's trying to she doesn't try to talk me into taking a woman, she's just telling me that we're working with her. She'll say, there's just something lovely about her. That means that there's 10 really bad problems associated with her, at least. And that's kind of the way things arrive. Women, when they come to the service, they come with more than just one. They might only be asking, give us help to come off the drugs. But actually, there's homelessness, or their home is at risk, there's charges, there's health, there's the children, there's school, there's social workers, there's all kinds of things. And addiction is different for women. Women get addicted differently. They stay addicted, they detox differently, they recover, and their aftercare is all different. And in the main, what's central to it is relationship. I just invite you to think, but how many of you, the very first time you had sex, were not drunk, or at least had taken a little something? The vast majority of people, when they start off having sex, they'll have a little something just to touch courage and boost their sense. Women do it all the time, particularly women who get caught up in addiction because they fear that they won't be able to please their partner, or they won't be able to feel connected with their partner. So they take the same drugs that their partners take. They often stay addicted, and there's often control involved. They look after the family home, he provides the drugs. Sometimes they have to go and find the money, then he takes their money and goes and gets the drugs. Lots of times women do drugs because they really want them, and they like them, and they're empowered by the fact that they want to do drugs. Not all women take drugs because they are victims, but a lot of time in the dynamic, there's unhealthy patterns there. Women's bodies are different to men. The way that they'll detox will be different. But if you are feeling shame, if you're feeling guilt, if you've been through all kinds of difficulties, then when you detox, you will detox differently. The drugs will leave your system in differently, but how you recover psychologically and socially will be different too. So whenever we're working with people, if we don't understand that all those kind of things are going on, then how we connect with people, how we build up that relationship is different. And what's bizarre is that when you think about addiction, I don't know what you know about addiction, and I'm not brave enough to start asking. I'm just going to presume that you don't. But when you think about addiction, you often think of Oprah Winfrey or Dr. Phil, or in the movies where people are off involved in AA or NA, and it's just stop taking the drug. You have a disease, stop it. It's often presented that the issue is located in the individual. You inherited bad genes. You're subject to this disease. Now stop drinking. It's a bad thing. Stop taking those tablets. Stop taking those drugs. And that medical approach, that idea that you can just cessate, and that if you don't cessate, you're a bad person and that you're making bad choices, is often an unhelpful one, because what it does is it locates the whole problem in the individual. It doesn't in any way begin to say, actually, maybe there was more going on. In the fellowships, AA and NA and CA and GA and all of the A's that are there, they talk about addiction as being a spiritual disease or a spiritual unease or dis-ease. And I think they're getting on to something there. Of course, there's a biological element to what's going on. Some people are more susceptible to drugs than others. Some people will have. But those genes are not strong enough to tip the balance, because it's actually the social learning that we have, the environment that we're in, that's really going to tip that balance. And so ultimately, addiction becomes that thing of the disturbance with self. My self-esteem will be low. My relationships with self will be poor. My belief that I can change will be poor. And my self-image, particularly in relation to social roles, is very, very poor. So when you're working with addiction, all of these things are present. They're all there right at the get-go. And so if you're encouraging somebody to change, you kind of have to start from that point. So there is the piece that there's a biological bit, but there's more of a piece that there's a psychological bit and the social bit too. And that's where relationship comes in. Because most people who are caught up in serious addiction have experienced trauma, usually extensive forms of trauma over longer periods of time. We don't hear that. When we're watching Love, Hate and we're getting the kind of the vibes, we don't hear about the trauma that's there. I don't know if anybody watched Love, Hate last night. But even watching the piece where, I can't remember his name, but he was cleaning up all the time, because he said he was up on his methadone and he was cleaning up. Ado, thank you. And Ado was doing that. Like, can you imagine what that does in a home? You know, you could see it being played out a little bit. Now, methadone doesn't tend to do that. Valium does. But methadone doesn't tend to. But what they were doing was tapping into something about how that kind of relationship, but even for herself, she was having a relationship, the attacking dynamic that was going on, the impact on her. We don't notice those kind of things. 75% of women and men in treatment for substance abuse report trauma histories. I used to work in a methadone clinic. Women who inject heroin who were coming into me, I stopped asking whether there was sexual abuse. There was no need to. Now, I didn't, if it came up, but a lot of the time people weren't ready to talk about that, but it was part of their story. And for an increasing amount of men, it was their story too, and at least at minimum, often minimized by the person themselves, physical abuse that was going on, not to mention the neglect that was present. Because we know trauma involves sexual assault, sexual abuse, domestic violence, interpersonal violence, witnessing domestic violence. I don't know of one woman in the SAIL project at the moment that hasn't experienced domestic violence. I couldn't tell you one of them. They don't come in saying we're victims of domestic violence, by the way, but I don't know of any one of them that hasn't. And an awful lot of them are onto their second experience. because they were children in domestically violent environments. And now they're repeating that pattern as adults, and sometimes with numerous. And if you are a woman in addiction, you accept a few slaps as normal. It's part of the ongoing trauma that happens. Harper's talking about the different kind of experiences. He talks about community violence. Again, we'll take the notion of drug dealing. When you're in a community where drug dealing is happening, the community violence that's there, being visited on you every day. If you've got a parent who's using drugs, the silence, the keeping out of harm's way, the not sure whether things will be there. But then when you're out on the streets where you're avoiding parts of your community, won't leave the house, won't cross that street, won't cross down that way, won't go down that stairwell because it's not safe or it's not able. I worked with a young fellow at one time who was given out to me for encouraging that he might ease back. He said, it's easier for me to get heroin. I look over my balcony and can call to them to bring up the heroin. It takes more effort to get alcohol. Imagine in Ireland, it was easier to get heroin than it was to get alcohol. We can get alcohol anywhere, but actually you'd have to cross the road to get alcohol. So that environment that we're in, and all of those then add to that prolonged exposure to repetitive or severe events, and that ongoing piece. And I think part of the piece that in working in addiction then, the awareness of the absence of essential physical and emotional care, and the absence of being able to soothe and self-soothe. And so we're working with adults, and they don't have this present. So, as Tom was saying, the fight, flight, freeze, submit, shutting down of non-essential tasks, rational thought, less possible. Addiction is an effective way of responding to trauma. Do you know, when you think about it, it's very, very effective. It's very clever. It does eventually kill you, but it does what it has to do when it has to do it, because nobody takes drugs in order to become addicted. So actually, it works brilliantly at the start. It numbs you. It can give you false confidence. It can make you part of something when all of your peers are doing it. It alienates you. It's irrational. It takes over and allows you to submit. It's brilliant. And often when we meet people, we don't meet them as survivors who chose this brilliant response to this ridiculous trauma or set of traumas that they're experiencing and maybe constantly experiencing in the now. What we meet them as victims or as people who need to be cured or diseased. And so when we meet them as brilliant people who have something to say about and share about and want it to be different, because they didn't want to become addicted. They want it to be different, but they have ways that there is a set of strengths there that we need to tap into. In trauma-informed care, they talk about safety and stabilization, and that's really our main work in SAIL. I know our funders believe that our main work is about getting people off drugs, and we do that occasionally too, but our main piece is that safety and stabilization, helping people get that sense of connection, the self-care, identifying a support system. But coupled with that, because we don't really do the second piece, that's for therapists. And even though we might be trained as such in SAIL, because we do lots of advocacy work, we don't believe that it's appropriate that we do that piece. But we do the other piece of developing friendships, intimacy and spirituality. We don't promote any particular spirituality, but helping people connect to that sense of purpose and other. And we do a lot of peer work to try and get people connected to giving to others, which is a new way of post-trauma work, if they've done that. So you can't do trauma-informed care without relationship. So you have to build relationships so you can do the work. So I wanted to just tell you a little bit about my own journey. I was a man in a traumatized woman's world. They wouldn't call themselves traumatized women, they'd call themselves women in addiction. And the thing was, I was the first man to work in Sale for at least 9 years. And the previous man before me was a project worker who'd only been there for about 3 months. So it was a women's world. I was this intruder. I was every dominant male that they had ever met. Not only that, they hadn't chosen for me to come. They were happy enough. I was employed by the board of management and brought in. I was every positive male as well. Kind of had them all. Because there was no other man in the project. Now there's 2 other men, 1 volunteer and 1 worker. And they share the burden of being every man that has walked the earth. But I was the one there. And I was an intruder to the staff too, bizarrely, because they weren't really kind of that keen on having a man come in the door. So I had to develop relationships with the women in Sale, ones that allowed recovery to happen, but ones that didn't really fit into a textbook. And I'd come from other settings where I had very clear boundaries. I'd worked in the HSE, and suddenly I was having to explore those boundaries, begin to see, okay, we have to work ethically, but also working in this strict way isn't going to work here. The women in Sale needed to know something about me. So when I started doing men's things. There's no point denying the fact that I was a man. So I started doing men's things. One of the things that I did, was to spring clean the building. I did ask permission first. But then I started doing things like there were sagging shelves, and I started to take them down and get rid of books that weren't touched and clean off dust. And then I managed to source money and got the place painted and new carpets down. And what I hoped that I was saying was that by the environment changing with their permission, with them choosing the colours, with them having some, that I was able to offer something new. I was putting myself out there a little bit. We did up the smoking area. We reclaimed the classroom. All of that over a number of years. But they were that kind of external visual piece that was saying, well, maybe we could do something different. The women had easy access to me, I think. But I met nobody on my own. So I was this big, fat, grey-haired fella. I could be any of the dominant males in their lives, any of the suits that they had to face. And when you think of a woman in addiction, think of all of the professionals she has to sit in front of in any given week. I was just another one of them. So I didn't want that to be this burdensome piece. So they were always coming in either with another one of the women or with one of the staff that we'd talk. I come from a harm reduction background. I'd worked in Analyphia, I'd worked in Merchants Quay, I'd worked in a methadone clinic. I didn't really care whether you got drug-free or not. I was more interested in stability and safety and making things clearer. So I could be generous. You know, lots of the staff had worked in this with this drug-free dream, and they were often bossier than I was. So I was able to be that bit more relaxed and generous. But critical was the children of the participants knew me. We had a children's project. I spent time in the children's project, just being and connecting with the children, because often the way to a woman's heart is through her child. They were able to win me over by making cakes and things in the kitchen, but I was able to win them over by creating that safe space, by handling things that said we weren't going to compromise their safety, but that the kids liked me. That was the real winner. What was most challenging to me at the time was that there was a demand to know who I was. I didn't realize that that would be as challenging. And one of the things was, who were my children? They needed to know that I was a father too, that I wasn't just pretending. So it was a big event for me when the kids, I've only got small children, but they came to look at the children's project. They were interested in the creche. They wanted to see where the other children played. They went and played with the other children. So the women will ask me all the time, how old are the kids, how are they getting on, when's their birthdays, what are they getting for Christmas? All of that will be part of the story. When I'd worked in a methadone clinic, when I'd worked in Merchants Quay, they didn't even know where I lived, you know. I was coming out of my house one day, and one of the women was passing by, how are you, Gary? There you are. And I was like, oh my God. But then I know where they live. So why couldn't it be the other way? Why isn't that okay? And part of that journey of developing the relationship For me, it changed me. And I think it changes anybody who works when you're in that space. It has made me more political, more angry at times, more vocal, braver. It has definitely increased self-awareness. I don't believe that I can be self-aware all the time. I'd love to hold up the image that Tom was portraying, but I know sometimes I drift into not being that aware, and sometimes that's all right, because the women will jolt me back out of that. There's an acceptance. I think sometimes we mirror that similar behaviour. Bringing your work home. My kids want to know about the work that I do. They're interested. I used to keep everything very separate. Don't bring your work home. Stress, burnout, all these kind of things. Part of it for me was, I'm very proud of the work I do in sale. Why shouldn't my family know? Why is it not okay to talk about that? So I had to find ways for that to happen. Because sometimes I will come home worried about what's happening in sale. I don't want that to be defining me, or every part of every day. If it is that, then it's a problem. But it's okay for it to be, because what's real is that I care about the women in sale, and they know that I care. But that doesn't just switch off when the day ends, and I can bring that home. I don't know whether that's sustainable, but that's where I'm at with it at the moment. One of the things that we found as a good rule of thumb in this is that, can we talk about it as a team? Can we talk about it with the women who are there as well? If we can't, then there's something wrong with it. If we can, then there's something right about it that we can make stronger. This isn't the first time I've presented this. I presented it this morning to a group of the women in sale, because I wanted them to give me some feedback on what was okay. And they talked about different pieces. I was talking about how we try to make sale safer and more welcoming. One of the women said straight away, she said, "Yeah, it's warm." And she was freezing cold where she was living. So she comes into sale just to be warm. Kind of like that, you know. Sometimes we talk about, let's create warmth for our clients. No, just warm was enough for her to be coming in the door. And another one did say, when she arrived at sale, and I was there at the door welcoming them in, I don't know why I was particularly there at the door, that I must have been doing something, and "Come on in, you're very welcome." And she said this big fat hairy fucker was at the door welcoming him in. "I thought this was a women's project. What are you doing here?" So I didn't want to come back because there was a man intruding on this space. But one of the good things about being a man in a woman's project is women who are in recovery, who have to rebuild relationships, need each other to talk, but then also need to find a new way of talking to men, of exploring that. And I can offer that gift too, and I hopefully benefit from it. Because in doing that, we have a greater sense in the team, and I personally have a greater sense of my own self-efficacy. I definitely have a sense of belonging. In a way that I haven't had in any other job that I've done, where I feel like I'm part of sale and I'm doing something really, really good. But also, I'm a bit less tolerant of bureaucracy. That's kind of gone downhill a bit further. It's very hard to look at poverty, to experience poverty, to see poverty on a daily basis, to see the children coming in, where you're fighting to try and get them decent shoes or a decent coat just to keep them warm, where the only clothes are really from pennies, and nothing wrong with pennies, but it's not really warm in a difficult time. Do you know that people don't have those? To know that there are people that they'll do their best to feed the child, they won't eat themselves, and they'll come into and will eat something in sale. To experience one, at one time, one of the women coming in and the children were smelly. And I was thinking, oh my God, neglect, not look after. She didn't turn in one day. So I said, that's enough. Going around to the house and see what's going on. And we went around, and you wouldn't keep animals in the place that she was being expected to raise her two boys. And doing absolutely the best she could. But just the damp, the way that she was being abused by the landlord, just the space that she was in, the lack of light, the lack of space, the lack of heat. And this was in the middle of summer, do you know? It was an Irish summer, so it was particularly damp. But the house was just, so it's hard. I know I'm running out of time. What time is it? 5 more minutes. In Sale, we do lots of education. So we kind of, we developed through Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, hopefully. I think sometimes we lose sight, but one of the things that we've done is we've developed different packages to work with people. If you're working and it comes across, these two here, Reduce the Use, which is about helping people to decide what they want to do about their drug use. Recover Me is about helping people to identify their emotions, often work that they didn't do when they were teenagers. They're free to download on the website, so help yourself. Solace to Sale is a 6-week group package for working with women who are involved in addiction but experiencing domestic violence. It's a wonderful piece, and what it has given us permission to do as a whole project is to talk about domestic violence without shame. We can now discuss it without people having to be sorry for saying that they're caught up in domestic violence. If you want that, we don't just leave it available for anybody because we don't want people who haven't got experience of domestic violence training or addiction to just download that. But if you want it, just email us and we'll send you a PDF. We do lots through art and drama and song. We're Irish. Of course we sing, of course we act. And lots of people who are given the opportunity will find that expression because it's another way of that relationship with self to be expressed, but in conjunction with others. One of the things, there's a lovely book of poetry on the website written by the women. You can download that as well if you've nothing better to be doing. But it's really lovely. They also recently created 2 short films on poverty. And one of them but they're both, I think, really good. But one of them just reflects on what it's like to be in the north in a city where there are 2 different communities of the wealthy and the poor, if you like, as defined by the IFSC. And just as a visual, it's a wonderful piece. The piece there, though, that is really good is Sale Sisters. It came up as a term when they were recording a song and they decided to call themselves the Sale Sisters. But it stuck. And part of it is because peer connectedness is important. Because the relationships that we talk about in recovery, we often think about it as worker to client and client to worker. But actually, probably the most powerful relationships are between the women themselves, facilitated. Yes, we create the environment and the safety, but they learn more from each other. And this is just a piece. We did a really nice piece with Community Technical Aid, where we trained a group of women in the aftercare groups to go and do research themselves. And they did a piece of research called I'll Have What She's Having. And what it says is, so when the respondents talk of value, they talk of seeing other people getting clean and wanting that for themselves. When they talk of benefits, they talk of feeling normal again because they usually feel like the other. When they name how important Sale is, they talk of feeling stronger, having increased confidence and independence. And I think that goes back to your question. It's not really about drug-free or drug stability. It's about, can they gain that sense of confidence and independence? And from that, the drug-free, the post-trauma life might be able to happen. In good community education and development, that participants feel ownership of the projects where they work. And I think that's part of the relationship piece, because as Tom was saying, it's about changing the dynamic from a power position of being the worker in charge to being something where we're struggling and working this out together. And the whole aftercare program was requested by the women themselves. And we were just lucky to access money at the time, and we were able to kind of rejig things around, and we were able to do it fairly quickly. And it's been powerfully taken up by the women, but they feel massive ownership because they came up with the idea and they're running with it. And part of that has been the relationship piece. Community development, you can't be a community project without a bit of community development. Collective focus rather than individual crisis. Challenging the relationship between users and the providers of services. Again, relationship really pushing that kind of notion that we're in charge. We're not in charge at all. We just happen to be there opening the door and letting the thing happen. And there's a great fun in that. But the thing about it is it's really challenging to me. I'm a control freak. So to actually be there and let it happen, let it emerge, let whatever happens, happen. it's funny when people, you know, particularly the HSE and our funders, they say, what's your strategic plan for the coming year? But, you know, that's an interesting one. Not really sure, because I'm not really sure from month to month where it's going to take us. And so we bluff it in the language of whatever is needed. But actually, relationship demands that we push that further. So to end, addiction does destroy relationships. So recovery has to be about relationship building. And sometimes the modelling of what can happen in relationships can happen in a safe place like Sale, so that it can be done elsewhere in the person's life. But it can't only just be with the worker, it can happen with each other, with all of the women who go into Sale. And I don't think Sale is that particularly special that it can't happen in lots of other places, particularly the addiction services. But relationship building requires the professional to take a risk and be in relationship with the other. And without that, it doesn't really stay real. I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks very much.